firstly speak about the first point: stop mass immigration. Now, what does that actually mean? Because when you think about it, what is mass immigration? How much is too much? How much becomes mass? When does it just go back to immigration per se? It's a very good question, and it doesn't necessarily have a specific answer. But one thing that we do know is in 2022 and in 2023, around about 1.2 million immigrants came in each year in 2022 and in 2023. 1.2 million long-term immigrants came in, far higher than the number of people who left, meaning that the net figure at the end of the day was somewhere around, in 2023, somewhere around 600,000. We'll have the exact figures for you in a moment when we look at a very helpful website which details all of this. So that's certainly mass immigration. And I was thinking to myself, if somebody were to ask me, what kind of figures should we be getting back to? What would I say? And there are two ways of looking at it. There is firstly gross immigration, which is just the sheer number of people coming in. And there is net immigration, which is the difference between the people coming in and the people coming out. So which of these figures should we choose? Well, we should really be choosing gross immigration, because if you choose net immigration, it's 1.2 million people coming in, 1.2 million leaving, and hey, 0 is the net figure. Yeah, but you still didn't want the 1.2 million people coming in the first place. So what we need to be looking at is just what is the gross immigration, in this case 1.2 million, and getting it right down to as little as possible. So I thought to myself, right, let us examine the figures. The mass immigration that we know today really started to take off after Tony Blair came in 1997, in May 1997. So let's look at the 30 years prior and inclusive of 1997. So that takes us back to, well, actually 31 years, 1967 figures right up to the 1997 figures. Let's look at that 30-year period in the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the first half of the 90s, when mass immigration was not really seen as a problem, not really seen as an issue for most people anyway. So let's look at what was the gross immigration each year from 1967 to 1997. And when you look at the figures, it is actually surprisingly high. But what you also find is that in many of these years, in fact, in most of these years, there was more people leaving. And you can imagine that's probably accurate. In the late 60s and 70s and 80s, there was a lot of white British people leaving for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, especially. And so in 1967, there was 225,000 people came in, and there was 309,000 people left. So the net immigration was actually minus 84,000. Let's bring up the screen which demonstrates this. Now, we'll send the link out for this page in the threads so that you'll be able to see it for yourself. But this is the long-term migration figures from 1964 to 2023 in thousands. And this handy graph down here, we can go to 1967. We can bring it up and it says that immigration, as I say, 225,000, emigration 309, meaning that the country was 84,000 fewer people in that year. 1968, 222,000 coming in, 278 left, meaning that was net migration of minus 56,000. And that continued right up until 1979. Here we are, 1979, when immigration in was 195,000 and emigration was 189, meaning that there was a net inward flow of 6,000 people, a little bit different from 2023, when immigration was 1,218,000, emigration was 532,000, and so the net inflow was 685,000. But as we say, the real figure that we need to concentrate on is the gross immigration of 1.2 million. And there also in 2022, gross immigration in 1,234,000, emigration 489, meaning a net inflow of 745, almost 750,000. Utterly ridiculous when you compare it to 1964, when in fact net migration was minus 60,000. So what I did this afternoon was I took the averages of the 31 years, inclusive of 1967 to 1997, to find out what was the average gross immigration over those 31 years. And the average was 229,000. Over those 31 years, the average emigration, the average outflow, was 238,000, meaning that over those 31 years, there was a net average of 9,000 people, just 9,000 people leaving the country over those 31 years. So that figure of gross average immigration per year coming into the country, 229,000, let's say 230,000, just to round it up. Well, we can at least say that we should be getting back to that figure. That should just be a normal baseline figure. We're currently cruising around the 1 million, 1.25 million gross a year. Surely the immediate aim should simply be to cut that straight back to the average gross immigration between the years 67 and 97, which would be cutting it back to 230,000, cutting it back by at least 1 million a year. That's a very reasonable proposition. I mean, that's still 230,000 people coming into the country each year. Now, we don't know how many people are going to be leaving, probably more than that. But so what? It doesn't really matter if people are leaving. It's about who's coming in. And so when we say stop mass immigration, what we're meaning is we stop the 1.2 million per year that are coming in and get it straight back to the historic average between the years 67 and 97. And that would be cutting it straight back to no more gross immigration, no more coming in than 230,000 a year. And that's an incredibly reasonable, incredibly liberal proposition. I personally would like to see it taken down far lower than that, but that's justifiable by historic norms. And in politics, you need to find ways of justifying your behavior in order to be convincing and in order to relate it to reality. And so that was the historic norm of gross immigration between 67 and 1997, was approximately 230,000 incomers a year. We're not talking about how many left. We're talking about incomers a year. We're not talking about the net. We're not talking about the difference between incomers and outgoers. We're just talking about getting it down to 230,000 incomers a year. for starters. For starters. And that can be easily justifiable, democratically, liberally speaking. That's a policy that everybody on all parties could get behind if they were reasonable, is getting it down to the historic norm between those 30 years.